We got some good comments on last episode from Locked On Winnipeg Jets about whether Kyle Connor should be on the top line and some questions about the center solution. Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, we're going to be starting off with a fun little comment that somebody left in our episode. First off, thanks for commenting on the last episode and engaging, but I thought I'd chat a little bit about, whether Kyle Connor really should be on the top line, because I think there's a couple of interesting arguments for and against. There's kind of like Camp A and Camp B, and we'll get into that on tonight's show. Also addressing some other stuff about the center problem and ultimately where Brad Lambert maybe fits in the grand scheme of all of this. But before we dive into an evening of fun, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Now, like I said, obviously we had a comment yesterday about Kyle Connor deserving to play on the top line because he's one of our top scorers. And I think traditionally that would be true, right? I think if you think about it, one of your league goal scorers, whether it's a David Pastrnak or in some cases maybe like a Nikita Kucherov, something like that, those guys very much play on the first line. And so you'd naturally say, well, Kyle Connor kind of fits in that category, doesn't he? And the answer is yes, to a point. KFC's always been one of those players who I feel definitely finishes at a really high rate, and he's obviously one of our most gifted goal scorers on the team. The problem with KFC that's always been holding him back just a bit is that the rest of his game hasn't always caught up. I will say that towards the end of Bones' tenure, we saw him be more engaged physically and defensively than I've ever seen him in a Jets uniform. So that was nice. And it's not like I'm asking him to back check aggressively or be, this two-way monster like Bergeron was. Just doing the bare minimum, I think, would have at least some level of impact, right? Maybe not a ton, but enough to where you'd feel somewhat comfortable. But the problem with Kyle Connor on the first line is that, yes, he would be playing with your most talented center. But the problem with that duo was that defensively they spend so much time in their own end that the value that you get out of those two together, it's questionable. As much as I would love to say that Scheifele and Connor together work, the only way it works is when you have like an Ehlers kind of carrying them. And I just don't think that's the best solution, right? Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde was just better. I know that it sucks to have to say that, but like Connor and Scheifele, when they play together, generally spend most of their shifts inside the defensive zone. It takes a lot for them to get up the ice. And so for me, as much as I wish it worked, and certainly, you might look at the box scores and think it's going okay, that only gets you so far. And a lot of times that line loses its matchups. And people will say, well, he's still scoring a fair bit. And it's like, yeah, but it's coming at a significant cost. And when it doesn't help the rest of your line matchups, it doesn't really benefit you in the grand scheme of things. The first line winning its zone possessions and manhandling the opposition sets up the other lines to continue to apply pressure at, the furthest back being the neutral zone, but more likely they can keep pushing waves of pressure on the offensive zone. That's a big thing for the Jets, especially for a team like Winnipeg that honestly doesn't have as much talent as some of the other elite franchises out there. So the Jets have to kind of rely on, offense by committee. And if their top line isn't able to win that battle and basically set the table, you're going to have an issue. And that's why I think KFC, it really wouldn't be a demotion to play with somebody like Perfetti. You have to get away from this idea that roles have to be done based on what you envision their role being, right? Like you have to think a little more flexibly with the chemistry, with the, I guess, balancing idiosyncrasies and weaknesses and strengths. I mean, if you played Perfetti with Scheifele and Connor, it'd probably work. But I think Scheifele and Connor struggle together so much that it almost makes me wonder, is it really worth trying to force the fit? And I know that the comment was that Ehlers plays an East-West game. I don't really think that even quite goes far enough. I think Ehlers, the way I always describe him is that he plays almost like a football winger sort of style, where he'll cut in, he'll use the perimeter play, he'll speed up the ice and really create transition, and then he'll start to create stuff around the box, or in this case, the goal mouth, right? So that is probably how I view it. And I think Scheifele just kind of has to get used to playing with that. It's not like he really struggles, because when he's with Ehlers, they tend to be super productive together. When he's with Connor, the scoring rates definitely take a bit of a hit. I know on the surface you'll say that they score a lot, but it's not quite as efficient as having Ehlers up there. And so, I think Connor could definitely run on the second line that's not really getting much less ice time than the first line, although the lack of an elite second line center does perhaps make that a little bit trickier. But I think, you could arguably have two lines that are roughly equivalent in deployment. And I don't think that that's necessarily going to ding KFC's production as much as you might expect. In fact, I almost wonder if it increases production because he'd spend less time in the defensive zone. I think that is something that maybe goes a little bit under the radar. He spends so much time having to wait for his teammates to get the puck up the ice and stuff that maybe if he gets on a line that's actually winning their matchups and is winning zone possession, maybe he actually goes back to having another 40-goal season. You notice he really hasn't touched like the 50-goal mark that he very nearly set a few years ago in a long time, partly due to injury, but partly just because his lines haven't really been that great. And I think that's one of those things where Connor needs a lot to be really successful. And I think there comes a point at which you just have to stop catering to that, or at least forcing the fit with the first line. Again, I think there's ways to make it work. I just feel like it's not the best allocation of resources. We see plenty of elite franchises out there place top scorers in more supporting roles, because if they get placed on the first line or something, their weaknesses get hammered and exposed. I think that is something that's important for the Jets to kind of counteract, because Winnipeg just doesn't have the depth in other spots to compensate for that if the top six isn't functional. And I think we saw that a lot with Bonus. Rick's top six was admittedly not the best way to do it. And I think you saw that especially made apparent when the Jets got into the playoffs and kind of got away from the script that at times Arniel had set during the regular season that was honestly more successful. So, I don't want to sit here and say like KFC is a bad player. That's not really the point. But it's about making sure that you're balancing each of these guys' strengths and weaknesses. And as good as KFC is at finishing, he does struggle in other areas that makes him hard to use with Scheifele. Scheifele's no defensive wonderkind himself. He's had a lot of issues over the years, and I think that is only going to get more noticeable as he ages out. So as much as I would like to make it work, I just don't think that logic necessarily holds the way it used to. So food for thought there. I think Cole and Kyle really should play together. I think that they've had good results so far, and I think that when it comes to each of their individual strengths and weaknesses, they actually balance each other pretty nicely. So something to think about. Now, kind of on a related note, I'm talking about Cole and Kyle on the second line. There's obviously been some concern about the second line center role, and really an argument that the Jets don't even have a first line elite center. Let's chat about that in just a moment, because I think that there's some merit to that. And also, I mean, it doesn't have to be the exact way that the Jets are built, but I think that there's a fair argument that the way the Jets are constructed maybe doesn't align with how most of the Stanley Cup winners are these days. But before we dive into that, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your vehicle alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. They've got superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has your back. It's just like building a championship team, right? You've got to find the exact fit for your roster, and your car is the same way. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your vehicle the MVP and bring home huge victories. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about some comments and feedback that we've been seeing on the past couple of episodes. Also, some stuff that I saw on Twitter today about Brad Lambert's future role and whether he's a second-line center or not. And I thought I'd dial into that a little bit because obviously that's the pressing concern for the Jets, but perhaps not one that's going to be resolved anytime soon. Before we get into that, though, just wanted to say thanks again for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day. But for your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your favorite podcasts, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, Brad Lambert, look, I am really hyped for him. I think that he is one of Winnipeg's bright future players. And I think when you talk about this youth movement and what Arniel is preaching, Lambert ticks off a lot of those boxes. And it's no surprise that as a center with the Moose for the past couple of years, he's really taken flight. But where I think the Jets run into a bit of a challenge with him is that he's one of those kids that A, needs to be confident, and B, if you throw him in too soon into a really big center role, it could be a little bit too much for him to handle. I'm not going to say that it is for sure. I don't know that he would necessarily have as much trouble adjusting to the speed of the NHL. I mean, he looked really good in his first game last season, but perhaps manning the spot between Kyle and Cole might not go that well. I think his defensive acumen and decision-making are still kind of a work in progress, and it's not like he has to be great at that stuff. More on the defensive side. Decision-making, you probably do want him to really get right. But I think looking at the Jets in sort of where their roster chart is, I think you can find a way to talk yourself into Nemesnikov. And I know a lot of you are like, he's not a second-line center. I get it. I hear you. But the reality is the Jets don't really have another player that Arniel will trust with that role. Lowry probably comes closest, and Lowry just doesn't quite score enough. I think he does a lot of the other work, and he probably would start to chip in more assists as a result of being moved into that spot, which I think that there's some interest in my mind to look at that. But, you know, it's putting a Band-Aid on a problem, right? And I think Lambert at 2C would probably be yet another Band-Aid. I think you can get away with it to a point, but I think in terms of winning those matchups, like I said, I think Lambert would probably have a rough start to the season. You know, he's going to be facing tough matchups in the second-line center role, and that might just be too much for a rookie. And maybe he completely shuts me up and proves me wrong in preseason and camp, but I just think you need to be careful that you don't submarine his confidence too early. He's a smart kid. He's hardworking. He's very skilled. And I think the last thing you want to do is instill doubt that he's capable of playing at this level. But again, he has been really good as a center, since moving to North American hockey. And I think that is his eventual best position. But I think to start with, I do wonder if the Jets maybe try and ease him into the league by having him play out wide. He has the Ehlers skating. He's got the transition ability. I don't know if he's going to be nearly as effective at it, to be honest. That is one thing that kind of sticks out. And I think the way that he approaches the game, playing down the middle, allows him to see more of the ice. allows him to be more explosive down the middle and utilize his flanks a little more effectively. So I think that there's a really good argument that he should play at center, but I'm thinking maybe after a few games in the NHL first. Let him acclimate, or if you do want to start him at center, maybe try him at the fourth line center role. And I know people will say he's not a grinder, he shouldn't be on the fourth, but you've got to not think about it that way. If Arniel does what I hope he does, he should treat his fourth as a scoring unit that's maybe, given 12 to 13 or maybe even 14 minutes a night and used more like a supplementary third line, right? Don't get locked into these traditional thoughts on how to deploy your lines. That one could become an effective secondary third line scoring unit if Arniel kind of gets the combos right. But, I also understand if that's not really the role that he wants. Gustafson's probably going to be fighting for a spot. Iafallo will be probably fighting for the fourth line spot. So I can see a lot of arguments for and against doing this, but I just think if you really want to start him at center, don't make it 2C immediately. Try it in preseason, see how it goes. If he really looks like he can handle it, then, by all means, that'd be great. It would answer a ton of questions and it would make our lives easier. A line of Connor, Lambert, and Perfetti could be really tasty if it flies almost immediately. I'm just not expecting it to. I think that there's going to be an adjustment period. I think it's going to take some time. And, Lambert's one of those kids who really thrives when he's feeling confident in his ability to execute his vision. So, it's a tough question. And I think, our next segment is going to talk a little bit about how you solve this question long-term, because, one comment was, well, that's what, Monahan and Toffoli were brought in to do. And it's not entirely wrong, but it's also not the full picture, right? Monahan maybe would have been the 2C, but I think we saw very quickly, and even before I kind of knew that this would probably happen, I just didn't think he'd be the guy. I thought he was great as a rental, but as a full-time Jets player, I didn't necessarily think bringing him back long-term made the most sense. Toffoli, not a center, too slow. I was hoping that he would pan out better, and at times during the regular season, he looked great, and I almost wanted to re-sign him then. And then it turned out it was kind of all for naught. He was awful after that. So really disappointing that didn't work out. But, for Lambert, the nice thing is that you have options with him. He does play center better than he does wing, but it's not like he can't do the wide and width play. So if that's where they start him, I could see that working out. But maybe they get even more ambitious and try him at 3C. I think that would be an intriguing option. I doubt they'll do it because Winnipeg probably doesn't want to throw him in too early into the deep end. And Lowry pretty firmly has that locked down. But in my mind, Lowry is like an elite shutdown fourth line center that, again, you could run as sort of like a second, third line. I don't think you have to get locked into the third and fourth, having really discrete differences and stratifications in their deployments. I think you need to get away from that because it kind of forces you to think about these groups in ways that maybe limit their ability and talent and artificially sets barriers on what they're capable of. Not that those barriers are always wrong, but I think for the Jets, again, for a team that's going to have to get offense by committee, don't stick yourself and pigeonhole yourself in ways that just don't make sense. Be flexible, be willing to adapt, and I think the rest will kind of come with it. And I think Lambert, perhaps as soon as this season will start to really prove his value down the middle and maybe even earn a promotion up the lineup. He is probably one of the guys that I think has the potential to really rise the fastest and break out the fastest among our rookies. And so it won't shock me if he gets that 2C nod sooner than later. I just think for the time being, right, to start the season, don't throw your eggs all in one basket and risk breaking something. But, at the same time, the other part of me is kind of like, at some point you're going to have to see what he's capable of. And maybe this is the time to do it when you've still got plenty of season left. You start off and you can sort of see if he's capable and then go from there. And maybe that's the best way to do it. I just don't know with him. It's tough because Winnipeg has put itself in a really weird position with the center depth. And, they're going to have to ask a lot of one of their top young rookies. But, he is certainly an elite professional and somebody who I think has a bright future. And if Lambert really is the real deal, then maybe he'll just take this role and fly with it almost immediately. Lord knows I would be begging for that. Now, on a related note about centers, there's an argument that the Jets don't even have a first-line center. And I want to chat about that a little bit because I think that is true to a point. And I've talked about this before, but I think there's ways around it. We'll chat about that in just a little bit. But before we go too much further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at Gametime. When it comes to buying tickets, a lot of you are used to paying big fees, hidden charges. Sometimes you're buying blind when you pick on a section and you're just buying a seat and you're not even sure what the view is like. Some of you have probably bought a ticket and found that you're sitting behind a giant pole, so you might not even see the event that you're trying to go to. Gametime knows your pain. They've been there before, and that's why they're here with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. It's why they're now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer you get to first pitch. And again, they come backed with their lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, and they'll give you last-minute deals, flash deals, and zone deals so that you can save all manner of ways right before that first pitch. For someone like me who's an Orioles fan, I find this great because Camden Yards is one of the best stadiums really in North America to get to a sporting event to. And having Gametime allow me to save time and money getting really nice resale tickets just makes it easy, right? So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just closing out with some final thoughts on the big center question for the Jets. Do the Jets have a 1C? The answer is yes, but not by championship contender standards. We don't have, one of those Barkovs or McKinnons or anything like that. We've got a guy in Shively who's really, look, he's a 2C on most of the most elite teams. If we're being honest, he's a point per game, but he doesn't drive play the way that McKinnon and McDavid can, right? He doesn't take over his shifts in that manner, which I don't think he has to. I think what you want from him is to be capable of keeping up on a top line that controls its matchups anyways. It doesn't have to be a line that eviscerates opponents on the back of one single player. Ehlers, Shively, and Velarde won their matchups by a huge margin, and even in their bad games, the most that you had to worry about was that they maybe just got a little bit unlucky and weren't able to convert every single chance, but they were still creating them. They were still playing really friggin' good hockey. That, to me, is how you get around that problem. But the bigger question is, okay, you can't get a Shifley to be your elite franchise center. Where do you get one from? The only way that you're doing that, there's two ways, and one is trade, and that's extraordinarily unlikely. The surest way to get to a top center is to tank, and the Jets just aren't going to do that. Winnipeg is not going to tank. I just can't see it happening. I think that is, unfortunate that Winnipeg probably could have gotten a lotto pick several years ago. The Line A1 not working out really sucks, but it would have been good to also maybe have a season or two where you really struggle before you got to this point, because now you've got Hellebuck locked up in his latter years. You've got a lot of good veteran talent that's either expiring or aging out. And so you don't really have the luxury of accruing top drafted talent by being at the bottom. And the Jets can't, financially afford to do that anyways. So the way that this is going to have to work is you're going to have to build through committee. And I think that that's fine. I think if the Jets roll 4 really strong lines, that can compensate for a lot because you've got friggin' Connor Hellebuck backstopping the rest. You don't have to win the way that other teams win. And there's also maybe something to be said about the fact that Brad Lambert might become a 1C. Look, I'm not going to sit here and say that this is the most likely outcome, right? We've talked about him as the 2C for a long time. But if Lambert really is what I think he could be, and he becomes a truly elite player, he might be the first line center that we've been looking for. Remember, a couple of years ago, he was like a top 3 projected pick, a franchise-level talent. At one point, I think he was as high as first overall on some draft boards. And this is several years ago, so don't, use that as your baseline. But there was a time when Lambert was talked about as a lottery pick. And Winnipeg is seeing that he is that level of talent at times with the Moose. AHL scoring rookie, if I recall correctly, clearly one of the most talented players in Winnipeg's system. And he's already adapted to North American hockey like it's nothing. So for me, I just think that he could be what we want. He could be that elite playmaker, the game changer, but getting from where he is now to that point is going to take a lot of growth. And that's why I'm not putting a lot of stock in that. So I think the most important thing for the Jets, build 4 strong lines, ones that can control play, roll pressure, and they don't have to be McKinnon or McDavid or those other guys. I mean, look at McDavid, right? He's on a team that finally made it to the Cup Finals, and they still lost. Like, their depth has been middling for years, at times even terrible, and the year that they finally make things click, it still didn't work. They still lost to the Panthers. So, for me, I think the most important thing is make a stable platform in Hellebuck that can roll through, all 4 lines, that can overload with pressure, and that can force your opponent into making mistakes. You're going to score plenty of goals that way. You're going to have Hellebuck to backstop the rest. And hopefully, as the defense starts to get faster and faster, you continue to evolve and become a more modern team. I think the Jets are poised to bring in a lot of interesting young talent. I think some of the players in their system are potentially really good NHLers. I don't know that they're going to be franchise level, but for some guys like Lambert, I am holding out a little bit of hope that they are willing to take that next step and become maybe even better than any of us are expecting right now. So keep that in the back of your mind, because obviously, we've been talking about the Jets needing to tank, to really get that talent. But if somehow Lambert becomes that would be a huge burden off of Winnipeg's shoulders. But again, that's like not just a best case scenario, that is like fantasy level. But I'm just saying it could happen. So keep an eye out for that. But I'd be curious to know your thoughts. Do you want the Jets to ever tank? Do you think that they should have done it a while ago? Do you still think that they should do it now? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. But for tonight's show, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here either tomorrow or this coming weekend, depending on how the recording schedule goes. But you will have more Jets coverage here in just a little bit. But like I said, thanks so much for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.